us to our first speaker. We have Kirsten Vanstone, the Executive Director of RCI Science. Let's hear it.
Well, it's my clicker, so I hope it works. Hello, everybody. I can't see you at all, but I know many of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm reviving a thing I did a few years ago with a little help from my colleague, Carrie Boyce. This thing was originally about people who... It's not going. Hold on. Point it? Actually, I think...
To the AV box.
Ah, look, it needed a light on. There we go. I don't know if you're familiar with the quote that Newton said, or maybe Newton, we see as far as we do because we stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, if you know anything about astronomy or science, I studied astronomy, sometimes those giants aren't quite as giant as we like to think. So I've put together a little story for you tonight about figuring out about 3 different eras in the history of astronomy that features some interesting characters, and with the help of Carrie Boyce, she came up with a new title for my talk. There it is. It's pronounced Uranus, by the way, but anyway. Starting. He who wrote to the king, the planet Venus is visible in the month of Adaru, is a vile man, a dullard, and a cheat. Who is this person who so deceitfully sends such reports to the king? If he doesn't know, he should keep his mouth shut. Now, this may sound like an exchange on Twitter, but in fact, it was an exchange conducted on, okay, we'll try it again, cuneiform tablet in 669, the year 669 BCE, in ancient Assyria. It followed with another one. As regards the planet Venus, about which the king wrote to me, I am told that it has become visible. The man who wrote this to the king doesn't know what he speaks about. Venus is not yet visible. Who is the, literally bleeped out because the tablet broke, that writes so to the king? He does not understand the difference between Venus and Mercury. This is 2 astrologers in the Assyrian court having an argument with a 3rd astrologer. I can give you their names, but really they are lost to the history of time. You can look them up if you want. The dispute was eventually resolved by having these 3 men go out and actually look at the sky and see that in fact it was Mercury and not Venus that they were talking about. Like it or not, scientific disputes go back this far, and we have documented evidence of them. These guys didn't behave all that nicely because back in those days, astrology was a very important thing. The kings, and well, there weren't really queens there, but they took this very, very seriously. And your life could actually be at stake. In some places, if you knew there was an eclipse coming, you'd actually replace yourself, if you were king, by somebody else, so that they could be king during the eclipse and then get killed at the end of the day, because that's what happened to kings during eclipses. So it was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this was important stuff. And as a modern astronomer, we kind of disparage astrology, like, oh, please, that's not really science. But the fact is that our modern science is rooted in this. And the observations that these people made actually ended up, well, ultimately ripping the Earth from the center of the universe. So from ancient Assyria, I want to take you forward in time to around the time of the Renaissance. And we are going to talk about the man whose skull I have pictured here. So these observations that astrologers made in ancient times, they basically led to a model of the solar system. So this was an idea where, of course, the Earth was at the center, because that's how people viewed things. I mean, we all know someone who thinks they're the center of the universe, but that's what the entire population of people who thought about these things thought. For about 1,000 years, that the Earth was at the center and everything went around us. And furthermore, everything up in the heavens was perfect. A lot of people still believe that. But over time, observations were made that kind of went against this. And this system started to crumble. We had something called the Copernican revolution, where the Copernican system replaced the old one. Now the Copernican system, what's at the center of the solar system there?
Sun.
The sun, right? Now everybody in this room probably knows about the Copernican system and believes that the sun is at the center of our solar system. 75% of Americans believe that. Actually, that's not bad, and I'm sure the percentage is the same for Canada, but we just don't measure that kind of thing that well here. But anyway, this revolution came by in around the time of the Renaissance, and there's a lot of really interesting characters associated with it, but probably the most interesting is this guy. The skull belongs to a guy named Tycho Brahe. He actually was born Tiga, but like many famous scientists of the time, they actually Latinized their names. And like Cher, they went by one name only. So he was Tycho Brahe, he went by Tycho. He had a lot of contemporaries. Nicholas Copernicus was Nikolai Copernic, actually, who went by Copernicus, and then there's another guy who we'll bring up a little bit later. Tycho Brahe was a very interesting guy. He was born a noble Dane, and he was promptly kidnapped by his uncle. Probably because his uncle had no children, was very rich, and Tycho's parents didn't have much money to educate him. So the uncle took him off and started to educate him, and he went to university in Copenhagen, and he started to run around with a very disreputable crew who was pulling his attention away from the study of law and starting to corrupt his mind with the studies of science and astronomy. And then he got into a fight with somebody about who was a better mathematician. The fight ended up in a duel, and what it proved wasn't that who was a better mathematician, but who was a better swordsman. Tycho's nose was cut off, according to the story. He used to wear a prosthetic metal nose, according to the story. Anyway, his uncle got him out of that mess and down safely to the University of Leipzig, where he was accompanied by a tutor who kept a careful eye on him, made sure he was studying the law during the day, and once the tutor went to sleep at night, Tycho went running around with the gangs of astronomers looking up at the night sky. And he became a very, very good observer. In fact, when his uncle died, he inherited a lot of money. About 1% of the total wealth of Denmark is estimated. So he went back to Denmark, and the king actually gave him an island for him to run like a tyrant, like an astronomical tyrant. He ran this island. He had 2 observatory castles, in fact. He had a little person that he kept who he thought could actually tell the future. His name was Jep, and he had a pet elk who wandered around with him like a dog, until one day the elk drank too much beer and fell down a set of stairs and died. And really, this guy was fascinating. Anyhow, I told you that Tycho was involved with the Copernican revolution. In fact, he didn't believe in the Copernican system, like 25% of Americans and probably the same number of Canadians. But the reason he didn't was not because he didn't like the idea, is that he couldn't reconcile it with his observations. So in fact, he thought that he could see the size of stars. So here's a star that's actually photographed through a telescope, and it's really what they look like. The stars aren't all that interesting through telescopes, I gotta say. But Copernicus didn't even have a telescope. He was observing years before Galileo first turned his to the night sky. So he was just looking at stuff through his eyes and using sighting equipment to measure them. He said, well, I think I can see the size of the star. And the problem that I have is in the Copernican system, on one side of the year, the Earth is on one side of the sun, and the other part of the year, the Earth's on the other side of the sun. So I want you to all try something without hitting your neighbor. Can you hold your thumb out at arm's length? Have a look at it through one eye, and look at it through the other eye. Then one eye, the other eye. Do you see your thumb shifting? Does it move against the background? Yeah? Okay, I can't see you, so you have to tell me whether you, okay. So imagine now your eyes are the Earth at different parts of its orbits, and your thumb is a star, and as you move, your perspective makes the star appear to shift. It's called parallax shift. And nobody could see it. And they said, well, that must mean the Copernican system isn't right, because we can't see this parallax thing. Well, the Copernicans said, no. It doesn't work if the stars are far enough away. Oh, okay. Then Tycho came along and said, I'm sorry, I can see the extent of a star, and if they're as far away as you say they are, which of course they didn't give a number, they just said really far, then if I can see how big it is, then that star's got to be way bigger than any star has any right to be. So he didn't believe in the Copernican system. Now it turns out, because you didn't have a telescope, you really couldn't see the extent of a star. To see the extent of a star, you need to have a really, really big star. This is Betelgeuse. You know Betelgeuse? Say it 3 times. Are we probably too young for that? Anyway, okay. Betelgeuse is huge. If you see here the diagram, it's not that great, but in the center you'd have the sun and Mercury, and then Jupiter would orbit inside Betelgeuse. It's the shoulder of Orion the Hunter, sometimes called the armpit of the Great One. Seriously, that's what the name translates to. But this image was taken by the ALMA telescope, the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, which is 66 100-ton radio telescopes that can simulate a telescope the size of a football field to one the size of a 16-kilometer radius city. It's massive, one of the most expensive pieces of scientific equipment ever built, and that shows us the actual disk of the star. Tycho wasn't seeing that. So his observations were a little bit false. So, but he really believed in them, so he actually created his own solar system, which he of course called the Tychonic solar system. And he put the sun, you can see the sun, I have no idea if I'm going to be able to do this, there we go. There's the sun, got some planets going around it, which takes care of all those pesky observations that made the Ptolemaic system not work. And he said, well, we can still put the Earth at the middle of everything and have the sun go around it with all the planets. In fact, mathematically, this is almost identical to the Copernican system, it's just a twist, it's very hard to disprove. Where it comes kind of interesting is that he published this, and then about 6 months later, one of his rivals published the exact same thing. And they got into a big fight. His rival was named Nicholas Reimers Baer, B-A-E-R, and he called himself Ursus. You get it? Baer, Ursus, yeah. And they had big fights, actually. Baer said that Tycho's observations were only made, all he needed to make his observations was to sight along his metal nose. And he then said that perhaps he's so jealous that his guts will burst with envy. Interestingly, if you know anything about Tycho, that actually happened. So he died in 1601. Here is his skeleton. He's been exhumed twice. So we can actually use the skeleton to tell whether or not some of these stories were true. He has holes on either side of his nose on the skull, which were the anchors for his prosthetic nose. They were tested. His nose was made of brass, apparently. Copper and zinc was found there, but he might have had a nicer nose for nice occasions. Hard to know. Most of the time he wore brass. But what they did is try to test the bones, the hair, anything that was left to see whether or not the suspicion was true that he was poisoned by one of his rivals. High levels of arsenic, maybe, or somebody else argued that maybe Tycho was medicating with mercury, which was a popular thing to do back in the day. Not such a great idea. Might have contracted Minamata disease and died. Well, it turns out, nope, his bladder exploded. He had a urinary tract infection, most likely, because he wouldn't get up and go to the bathroom during a feast with the king. Kind of an odd guy. Anyway, let's move on. Some of the other jerks of the scientific revolution. Some of these photos aren't coming up quite right, but we have Newton here and Robert Hooke. They were absolute rivals. One was president of the Royal Society before the other. One didn't want to publish Newton's Principia. When Newton finally came in to be the president, he managed to forget Robert Hooke's portrait in the old Royal Society building, and they moved out. Either that or he took it down and destroyed it. We're not sure. You also have Kepler. Johannes Kepler. My a history of astronomy professor walked in on his lecture for Kepler, and he sat down at the front and he said, Kepler was a miserable bastard, and that's pretty much true. Didn't have a great life. And then finally we have old Galileo here. You've all heard of Galileo. Poor Galileo, right? Guy, sentenced to house arrest, had to recant, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, well, Galileo did some pretty choice things. He actually created a character called Simplicius, like simpleton, to spout the words of the Pope. The very things the Pope had said, he put into the mouth of a character called simpleton. You might see why he was in a little bit of trouble. And finally, down on the right, we come to the modern era. This is the tomb of a guy named James Lick. He was a bit of an oddball. He endowed an observatory, the first mountaintop observatory in the world, on top of Mount Hamilton, outside of San Jose, California. And when he did this, his friend said, oh, great, James, but now you're getting old and you're dying. Maybe you want to scatter your ashes at your great telescope. And he said, no, I want to be like a gentleman. I want to rot like a gentleman, is what he said. So he's buried underneath the telescope. Now, how creepy is that? Really strange. Anyway, you can go visit his tomb, as I did about 20 years ago. So, we come to the modern era. If you know anything about astronomy, you know that part of what has happened over the past 2,000 years is we've slowly been ripping ourselves out of the center of the universe. You had the Copernicans come along and take the Earth out of the center of the universe, and later on, we actually took even the sun out of the center of the universe. It no longer is. The sun is, as Douglas Adams described, in a backwater of the Milky Way galaxy, but we didn't always know this. We thought for a long time that we were at the center of everything, and that our universe was the entire Milky Way that you can see out in the night sky around us with all of its beautiful features. But there were some troubling problems with that, and one of them was that we had these other things that looked not like these gas clouds that we call nebula that we know are in our Milky Way. They actually look like spirals, very strange things. And some people said they are outside of the Milky Way, and other people said they are inside of the Milky Way. That's basically the great debate. I mean, wow, So in fact, they organized a debate to debate this. In 1920, the National Academy of Sciences brought two famous astronomers to Washington, D.C., Harlow Shapley and Curtis, what's his name? Heber Curtis, sorry. So it was the Shapley-Curtis debate. So they came to Washington. Originally, they wanted to do this great debate about relativity, but the secretary of the National Academy said nobody understood relativity, so there wasn't any point. We wanted to have people, like more than 6 people in the room who understood what it was all about. So they said, but the size of the universe is something we can all get behind. So they came out, and Harlow Shapley, interesting guy, he actually studied globular clusters. Let me show you a picture of one, because they're really pretty, and I'm an astronomer, so I have to show you pretty pictures. There you go. Really, really beautiful objects out in the sky. In fact, they circle our Milky Way like a halo. And he studied these things probably because they're pretty. But Harlow Shapley actually fell into a career in astronomy kind of by accident. He wanted to go to study journalism, and he ended up looking, the journalism course wasn't ready yet, so he had to wait a year. So he looked in the course catalog, and he saw this name at the top, and he couldn't pronounce it. It was archaeology. He goes, I can't pronounce that, so I'm going to go down to the next one, astronomy. So he said, okay, I'll take that. And he did. So he ended up going down, working at Mount Wilson Observatory in Los Angeles and studying these things, and he determined a few interesting things. These things are part of our Milky Way galaxy, and he could use them to tell that the Earth and the Sun were not in the center of the galaxy, that these globular clusters told him that the center was away from us, so we were actually off on the side of this thing, and that furthermore, our Milky Way galaxy was much bigger than anybody ever thought, so in fact, those spiral nebulae must be inside of the Milky Way. His rival, Heber Curtis, actually worked above the body of James Lick at the Lick Observatory in San Jose, so that's like a northern and southern California rivalry as well. And he argued the opposite. He said those spiral nebulae are actually definitely outside of the Milky Way. So who won the debate? Neither of them. They were both kind of right, both kind of wrong. At the time, Shapley was right. The Milky Way was much bigger than anybody thought, and the Earth wasn't at the center of it. But in fact, a few years after the debate, they were able to measure the distance to one of those spiral nebulae using, it was actually a janitor, a former janitor from the observatory, the Mount Wilson Observatory, a guy named Humison. He was actually a mule driver as a kid. He moved up to the observatory at age 14 and begged them for a job. They let him clean the floors, and then one day he discovered a star in this galaxy, which we now call a galaxy, and this star varied with a way that was really special. It actually got brighter and dimmer, and if you measured the brightness and the dimness, you could actually tell how bright that star would be. If you measured how long it took to go through its cycle, you could tell how bright that star would be if it were actually at the distance of the sun. It's not at the distance of the sun, it's really far away, so it looks a lot dimmer. And you can actually calculate how far it is, and that was Edwin Hubble who did that. And he said, no, this thing is definitely outside of the Milky Way. He also calculated that the universe was younger than some of the rocks we find on Earth, so there was a little problem with Hubble stuff. But what's interesting with this whole story, and why it has an interesting ending for me, is that Harlow Shapley got a bit of a bad rap. After Hubble did this, a lot of people said, Shapley was wrong, he's a mean guy, he actually got a job running the Harvard Observatory, so not too shabby. There's a few stories about him being not the nicest person, but in fact, it turns out that he may just have been maligned, because there is an FBI file about this thick on Harlow Shapley. He testified in front of the House of Un-American Activities Committee because they thought he was a communist. Why did they think that? Because he thought that the United States should bring in scientists from other countries where they were being persecuted and let them come as refugees. He also went to Russia once to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and probably most damningly, he worked on Christmas Day. But Harlow has a very local connection, one that's very close to my heart. He actually worked a lot with women in astronomy. The Shapley-Ames Catalog of Galaxies is actually named for a female astronomer. Her name was Ames. I don't remember her first name, but it's one of the only naming catalog systems in astronomy that's named after a woman. And also, one woman in particular, this lady, she grew up in New England and studied astronomy at Radcliffe University, Radcliffe College. She went to Harvard, married a guy named Frank Hogg, and he was Canadian. And she was mentored by Harlow Shapley there, her PhD in astronomy, worked with him on globular clusters. And then when Frank got a position running a thing called the David Dunlap Observatory, which is up in Richmond Hill, she came with him. And she actually said, well, I want to observe, so I'm going to go and do my observing work. I'm not going to be paid as a full-time astronomer. I'm going to sit up here at the prime focus of the 74-inch telescope. That's a long way off the ground, up in this little cage. Sometimes she had her children in cribs on the floor of the observatory. She used to pass photographic plates down on a pulley system in her handbag to get processed down below. Her name was Helen Sawyer Hogg, and she was a big inspiration to me. She wrote a column for 30 years in the Toronto Star. She wrote a book called The Stars Belong to Everyone. And she is why I think that in my graduating class, there were 3 women and 2 men. I'd like to thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.